so torn about this Texas A&M team, and it's not so much because of Mike Elko. I think Mike Elko is a phenomenal coach, and he deserves a lot of credit for what he's done so far. 2 top 10 recruiting classes. Right now, he's 8th right now. He's done a phenomenal job at weathering the storm that Jimbo Fisher created behind him, and for him to be able to go through all of that, be able to keep some of the players on the roster, at least some of the ones that are immediate contributors. And you've been pretty aggressive in the transfer portal. Obviously, it helps that you have a good amount of money behind you. Obviously, it helps that you play in College Station with one of the best fan bases in all of college football. And it helps that Mike Elko also has some history in College Station too, which I think also kind of puts everything into perspective too. But going into this year, they were 8-5 this year, and they had some tough losses. I think of the South Carolina game. I think of the Texas game, where if they had any sort of passing attack whatsoever, they probably could have put a little bit more pressure on the Longhorns to really get things going. I think of one of the best games I saw all year, which was the 4 overtime game versus Auburn, which was absolutely phenomenal to watch. But the more I look into this season or this upcoming season, I just think that Texas A&M success that they might have is a lot more indicative about Marcel Reed, but I think it's also multi-layered in some regard too. Obviously, the big story is going to be Marcel Reed because for the most part, a lot of his attributes are much more related to him as a runner and also as a playmaker. But based on how Colin Klein is setting up his offense and based on some of the transfers that we've seen, such as Casey Concepcion from North Carolina State, Micah Hudson from Texas Tech, who's a dog and is going to be a huge vertical threat for this team. So I think Aggie fans should be really excited about him. And also Mario Craver from Mississippi State, who I'm sure Texas A&M scouts have done some homework on, and I think he's going to be another immediate weapon too. So with all those weapons coming in, the first thing that kind of comes to my mind is, for the most part, too, Texas A&M's offense last year was predicated on a quarterback who has the athletic ability to make some runs, have a couple passes here and there, and be a little bit more balanced. Because we even saw that with Connor Wegman. He transferred to Houston now, but you look at Wegman's sets and Reed's skill sets, and I think in many ways this offense is going to be not as tailored to him anymore. And what I mean by that is I think Colin Klein is going to be asking Marcel Reed to take a bigger step than I would argue perhaps he's ready for. He's a sophomore right now, and there's a number of different things that they're going to have to improve on. I mean, first things first is Marcel Reed has not shown that he can be a serious threat as a passer, particularly within the deep ball. Texas A&M ranked 111th in the country in terms of passing attempts of 20 plus yards or more. And Marcel Reed ranked 85th with a passer rating of 82.5. And overall, those stats are from Pro Football Focus, but you sit there and say to yourself, I think Texas A&M's offense is going to be fundamentally different than what we've seen in years past from Texas A&M. And overall, they've done the work in order to get themselves there, right? They've done a ton of homework, particularly on the transfer portal. They brought in 23 scholarship transfers from last season. They have definitely spent a lot in NIL and getting all that going, especially in the SEC now. Everybody has money. Everybody's going to be competing. And what gets me excited about the SEC in particular right now is that it's as wide open as ever, because the Big Ten has won the national title for the past 2 seasons. And you have to imagine that, the athletic directors such as Greg Byrne and, Greg Sankey are probably all chomping at the bit saying, man, it's time for the SEC to come back and, kind of have that flavor again. So with that said, it kind of asks yourself, okay, well, Marcel Reed is going to have to make a big giant step forward, but at least they got the weapons there to contribute to that. However, Texas A&M's struggles this year aren't necessarily just about Connor Wegman and Marcel Reed. I do think it is a huge positive that they do see that Marcel Reed should be the starter going into the season, because I absolutely do see what fans and the coaching staff see in him. I think the most brilliant example of this would be watch him for the LSU game. If you don't watch him for the LSU game and you don't sit there and say to yourself, man, there's something about this kid that can get me excited and can definitely tune him up with a little bit of one-on-one time, with a little bit from Coach Colin Klein. I mean, I think there definitely is something there. Although for the most part, the stats are a little bit discouraging in a number of different ways. But I would also argue that the stats aren't necessarily there because I think one, the offensive line definitely did not play as strong as they have in years past. I also think they were playing somewhat sloppy and undisciplined in the sense of it's hard to sit there and ask Connor Wegman or Marcel Reed to really get into a rhythm and do all these things when your offensive line is not doing their thing, when they really don't have as many weapons as you would like. And I think for the most part, that's one of the big reasons why we saw Texas A&M run the ball a lot more this year too. Especially when you have a guy like Le'Veon Moss who had 10 touchdowns, 750 yards, and I think if he wasn't hurt for those last couple games towards the end of the season, I think we're talking about a Texas A&M team that probably could win 10 games because especially after the LSU victory, it wasn't necessarily far-fetched to sit there and say that Texas A&M could beat Texas in the final game of the season. I certainly wasn't saying that wasn't going to happen. I wasn't saying it was going to happen, but it wasn't far-fetched at the time to sit there and say, I think Texas A&M could pull off that upset, especially given that at the time we already knew that Texas would be in the SEC championship game. So it certainly was possible in that regard that they could that the Longhorns could be putting their foot off the gas a little bit and giving the Aggies some room to breathe. But with that said, when you look at Texas A&M overall, aside from their offense too, which they're definitely taking a lot of action on, a lot of their recruiting class that is coming in. I believe they have 4 or 5 different offensive linemen coming in. So you have to hope that although the offensive line is definitely going to be a little bit younger, you do have to say to yourself too that the 2025 schedule is a little bit more generous for Texas A&M overall, even though, yes, they do play LSU again, they do play Florida again, they do play Arkansas again, and I believe they play Missouri again too, which by all in all, those are all games that are definitely winnable, even though I think Florida is going to take a major step up this season compared to the seasons past. But overall, when you sit there and you look at this defense now, Mike Elko made a big move the other day by bringing in James Madison's defensive coordinator, Lyle Humphill, who was on Bob Chesney's staff last season as defensive coordinator and elected not to go with Mike Elko. But I think this year he'd finally decided to take the step and join him as a senior assistant. And I think that's going to be a move that is kind of under the radar, but it's going to be those subtle moves I think are going to be the big difference maker for this Texas A&M team to really kind of be their identity. So with that said, you say to yourself, hey, they're going to have to take a big step in terms of the secondary too. I think they were definitely banged up a little bit more than you would like to see. And Mike Elko's background, he was, phenomenal at Duke. He knows how to recruit. He's a master of the X's and O's. But again, it just comes down to, can they clean up the sloppy play that we've seen on both sides of the football? Can they establish that they have at least a solid offensive line, enough to the point where Marcel Reed can go through his progressions and be a lot better, particularly on the deep ball side of it? But also at the same time, too, they did bring in enough weapons to the point where Marcel Reed can make an immediate contribution. And you sit there and say to yourself, if he struggled a little bit his freshman year, you just have to hope that you don't see a sophomore slump from Marcel Reed. But overall, I mean, it's hard to sit there and criticize Mike Elko's defense too much because in many ways, if anybody can figure it out, it's him. He's weathered the whole storm with Jimbo Fisher. It's just a matter of, can this vision with Colin Klein's offense and Marcel Reed essentially turning into a pass-happy team now, is it too much too soon for them to really kind of put this together based on what we've seen? Because when you look at 65th in the country in pass efficiency, 87th in the country, neither one of them have over 300 yards in any game this season. And that's even with considering that they've even played some tune-up games versus New Mexico States of the world and whatnot too. It definitely leaves you to be a little bit skeptical. But at the same time, when when you've landed some of the top receivers in the country, when you have a solid offensive coordinator like Colin Klein, and I don't think you have to worry about the defensive side of the ball as much as other people would think. I do think they have a chance to be successful here, but I think they are taking a big chance at essentially completely changing their identity here and doubling down on passing the ball, much